All right, in this video, we're going to be going over how to create data visualizations in ggplot. So the first thing that we'll touch on is how to install and then call up ggplot, how to create a basic scatter plot in ggplot, how to create a bar graph in ggplot, and then how to create a line graph in ggplot. Now the data set that we're working with is a simulated data set based on a hypothetical experiment looking at two different teaching methods, an old method as opposed to a new method, where the biological sex of the participants is recorded, as well as their scores on a pre-test for the instruction and a post-test after the instruction. So, let's get started. Now, ggplot is a package that you would have to install. And specifically, it is ggplot2. Now, I've already installed the package, so I'm not going to run that code, but rather what I need to do is actually call it up in a library. And I have to do this every time that I actually open R. So here we can see that I ran it, and it's letting me know, hey, it's in a different version. Okay. So we're going to be creating these data visualizations using ggplot. Now, how you actually go about doing this is essentially adding pieces of the graph one after another in different layers. So we're going to start by saving the output of the ggplot function to an R object. In this function, the first thing we need to define or specify is the data we're actually going to be visualizing, specifically the data frame. In this case, it's teaching method experiment. The next argument that we need to include are the aesthetics of this graph, or what are the parameters for this graph. So AES for aesthetics. And so what do we want on the x-axis? So I come over here, I want my pretest score on the x-axis. And what do I want on my y-axis? I would like my post-test score. Okay, so that gives me the basics. Now you'll notice when I run that code, nothing really shows up because I've actually just saved it right over here. So when I look at graph 1, if I were to print that out, I could see the basics, right? This is my y-axis, this is my x-axis, but there's nothing on here yet. We have to add the different geometric objects that represent our data one layer at a time afterwards. Specifically, we come over to graph 1 and we add, using the plus sign, a layer of some type. In this case, it's a geometric object for geom, and then point. We want points where all the data are. So now when we run it now we have what we would consider to be a scatter plot, where we have scores on the post-test, on the y-axis, scores on the pre-test, on the x-axis, and we have all our data points scattered all the way throughout. So at bare minimum, we've created a scatter plot. However, this scatter plot is not a point where we would really want to use it as a data visualization. We'd want to change these labels on the x and y axis to something that is not our shorthand in R. We probably want to make this graph look a little bit more professional. So get rid of the background, maybe get rid of the grid lines, so to speak. And then maybe actually color our points by our different conditions as well. So let's work through that one piece at a time. First thing we're going to do is actually add colors corresponding to our different conditions. So this is actually an aesthetical parameter of the overall graph to begin with. So we come up here and we want the color to correspond to the teaching method. So we run that now, and now we see we have two different color points corresponding to our teaching method, new and old. Let's tackle all these labels, and now we actually have a third label we want to tackle as well in teaching method. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can do this. We're going to go over one. This next one is to add a layer called labs for labels. So we want our x-axis label to correspond to the following string value: pretest, score. We want our y-axis label to correspond to post-test, underscore, and we want the label of the legend for color to correspond to teaching method. All right, we run that and we can see that our labels have improved. All right, the next layer that we're going to be adding is more sort of parameters controlling how the graph looks. In this case, we need to add the layer theme. Now, when you do this, you can literally go through and specify every single little aspect of the graph, where the axis text marks are, the legend background, the legend margin, the panel background, so on and so forth to your heart's degree. However, there are also a couple preset themes that are there ready for you. So theme black and white, or theme BW, looks very similar to the current plot we have, only it ditches the gray background, goes with gray grid lines, and it's a little bit cleaner. Theme classic is what most of you may be used to when you look in a scientific journal article where there are no grid lines and there's just a simple axis line. So let's go with that one here. All right, so there we have our nice, pretty scatter plot. Now, if we wanted to do some other things, such as make these points a little bit bigger, we can go through doing that too. So we want to modify our geometric object. Specifically, we want to modify its size. And let's make that size equal to 2. Voila, we have bigger points. Maybe we wanted squares instead of circles. We can actually go through and change the shape of our points. Now, there is a code book for this somewhere out there in the depths of the internet, but essentially all the shapes have a numerical code. Shape 1 is an unfilled circle. Shape 2 is an unfilled triangle, so on and so forth, and you can kind of just keep going. I think shape 15 is a filled square. Shape 16 is that filled circle, which is the default. Let's go with those squares. So you can go find that code book that tells you what each and every single shape is. So that's the basics of a scatter plot, where you specify what you want the graph to be overall and the aesthetic parameters of the graph, and then you go through adding one layer after another layer after another layer until you get the graph that you ultimately want. So scatter plot, that's sort of the most basic way to approach it. Now let's move on to a bar graph where we add another layer of complexity, because we would actually like summary statistics represented in a bar graph and not just the individual value of every single data point. So it starts out the same, or actually very similar. However, there's one thing we need to do first before I forget it. We actually need our teaching method, which is currently just stored as a string value, to actually correspond to a factor. So to go about doing this, it's actually pretty simple. Specify the data that we're looking at, and then we need to reassign it as a factor. And the input for that factor is going to be our teaching method. Okay, I'm actually going to break this across lines so that it's easier for us to see. That's the first argument we need. And then the next argument that we need is actually our levels. And then specify each of those in sequence, old, new. Now, if you had a numerical code, you would need to go one step further where you actually apply labels. We'll just go ahead and do it for the sake of being thorough here. Although we're really just going to apply the same thing. We wouldn't technically need to. But if you coded new versus old teaching method with a 1 or a 0, that's how you'd want to do it. Okay, so you can see up here, now our teaching method is a factor with 2 levels, old and new. So now we're ready to start putting this into ggplot. So just like before, we're actually going to save this to an R object, and then we're going to have the ggplot function. We're going to specify the data that we're actually pulling from, the data frame, and then we're going to specify our aesthetical parameters. On the x-axis, we now want teaching method. On the y-axis, we still want our post-test score. Let's go with that to start. So, expected parentheses. Okay. There we go. Now, we plot out, print out graph 2. It looks like a lot of nothing, but you can see it's the basic bare bones and skeleton of the graph. So now we need to add layers. Now, we're going to add another geometric object. However, in order to do that, we actually have to calculate these summary statistics first. How that works. ggplot is stat summary, and then we need to specify what we actually want. So what we want represented is a function of y. Specifically, we want the mean of y. Then we need to indicate what type of geometric object we would like. In this case, we would like a bar. Now we have 2 bars representing the mean. Now, obviously, if we were graphing this up for something in a scientific manuscript, we would need more than just the mean. We would also want to represent either a confidence interval or standard error or something like that in an error bar. To do that, we add another layer. So another stat summary. In this case, it's a function of the data, and then we want the mean, specifically the standard error of the mean. The geom we want, the geometric object that we want, in this case, is going to be an error bar. Now, we have the basic essentials at this point. We got the y-axis, we got the x-axis, we got our 2 levels here, we have our bars corresponding to the mean, and error bars with standard error of the mean. That being said, we need to improve this graph a little bit. Step 1, let's make these error bars not quite so wide. So, width on these error bars, let's go with 0.2. There we go. Now we have those error bars looking a little bit more reasonable. Okay. We still need to address these axis labels as well. So let's use that labs function that we already used once. Teaching method, y equals test score. Prove that and that. Now let's add the theme, make it look professional again. Go with theme classic. So we've just added these layers one after the other after the other. Now, let's say we want to adjust the colors of this. Now, we could have the color of these bars correspond to the condition, just like we did before. But let's say we're putting this on a poster and we would like our school colors on it, or the colors of our institution. So, you can actually specify this as well. So when you come up, say we're working on the colors of the bar, we want to adjust the color of this geometric bar. First things first, let's change the color. Now, you could type in red or blue or whatever it happens to be. So, for example, you could type in red, and it would give us these nice red borders. Or, you could type in blue and get those blue borders. Okay? However, you can also use HTML color codes to do this, so you can get the exact color that you want. So in this case, let's give ourselves sort of a nice navy blue color for the border. All right, and now let's also adjust this fill color. Let's make it a gold. FECB. Forgot a comma. There there we go. So now we have these bars with these navy borders, and we could probably make these air bars match as well. So come down to our air bars and let's add that color such that everything matches quite nicely. All right, now everything's that navy blue and that gold. Now, you could add even more over the top of this. Let's say you wanted an aligned dot plot over the top of this bar graph so that you can see where each individual score lies in addition to the mean and the standard error of the mean. To do this, all you have to do is add another layer. So add a plus sign after the last element, and then this next layer would actually be a geom point, just like we did for a scatter plot. So now we have those points over the top. Let's say we want to change the shape of those points to unfilled circles so we can see a little bit of overplotting. Now, it may be the case that you actually want a line graph to represent this data because maybe you have something that's repeated measures, or your independent variable is something like a dose, where there is a literal continuation between one category on the x-axis and another one. So that actually ends up looking really similar as well. So graph 3 now, it's going to be ggplot again, and it's actually going to end up looking identical to this ggplot up here, where the first thing that we specify in this argument is our data frame, teaching method experiment. Then we need to specify the aesthetic parameters. What do we want on the x-axis? We want teaching method. What do we want on the y-axis? We want post-test score. So we look at graph 3. Again, it's just that basic skeleton, so we need to start adding layers. Let's add this first part, which again, similar to the bar, is going to be a stat summary. So stat, underscore, not period. Stat summary, function y. We want that function to be the mean. For our geometric object, we would like a point. So now we have points. Now, obviously, this isn't how we want the graph at the end of the day, right? So let's work on changing those points to something that works a little bit better for us. Let's change the size of the point, and let's make those a lot bigger because it's not a scatter plot. Let's go with a 5. Let's change the shape of that point to 15, so nice square. All right, now that we have those points set up, let's add air bars. So this is going to look exactly the same as the prior, where we have a function of y of the data equal to the means, standard error, the geom, geometric object, we want air bar. So we have those air bars, and now it looks rather comical with as wide as they are. So let's bring that down. Let's go with 0.1 sounds good. Yep, that looks about right. So we have those air bars. Now we can go about changing some of the other stuff. We could still actually change the color of these air bars and these points. So let's go ahead and let's make everything actually this time that navy blue. And we want the same for the air bars. Oh, not gray. Not gray. All right, the next layer we'll probably want to add is a line between the two mean values. So as we find between the two mean values, it's going to be another stat summary function, y being the mean, and the geom that we want is a line. And then you need to add one more piece of code where you specify and you tell the graph, tell ggplot that we only want one line, as opposed to two if you were doing a factorial experiment. So there we are right there. We have this nice graph. Now let's change up the graphical parameters a little bit. Let's change these labels. Let's change the theme back to something that looks a little more professional. So another plus sign, labs, and for the x we want teaching method. For the y-axis we want post-test score. And next layer we want to add would be our theme. We are going with theme classic. And there we go. Now we have this awesome graph as well. All right, now let's say you wanted to change the y-axis. Let's say we wanted this y-axis to peg out at 100 and then finish up at 0. We can do that as well. Next layer we would add is ylim. What do we want the minimum value to be? What do we want the maximum value to be? And there we go. So in this case, let's change it, make our point a little smaller, and then subsequently drop the size of our error bars. And then we could have that graph. Now that may not be necessarily what you want, but that's how you would go about doing it. So in sum, whenever you're adding something in ggplot, what you're really doing is specifying the basic parameters for the graph, what data do you want, and then where do you want all these pieces of the data to be represented, and then you add layer after layer after layer after layer and iteratively build up your graph.